going to do today is we're going to move on to other pieces of legislation other than the Medicare bill of 1965 that were passed during the time that Lyndon Johnson had his own administration. And I want to re-emphasize that he was the guy that really got a lot of laws passed through Congress. He's one of the top presidents of having legislation passed during his administration, if not the top. Okay? Here's some more important laws that were passed during the Great Society. You've heard of this one, the Highway Beautification Act. And basically what that is if you drive down the roads and you see different organizations picking up trash out of the, what I call borrow ditches. I don't know what you guys call those things between lanes on the interstate. Borrow ditch, I call it. That's a borrow ditch, right? Well, anyway, when you see people clean up highways from here to Tensleep or from here to Shoshone or on the interstates, that's part of the Highway Beautification Act. And actually, this was initiated by Lady Bird Johnson. She thought that our highways were looking sad with trash, etc. So she talked her husband into initiating to Congress a Highway Beautification Act. And it was legislation initiated by Lady Bird Johnson that called for the beautification of highways. And so that's just part of it when you see these groups out cleaning up trash. It all began with the Highway Beautification Act. Have you guys ever been involved in that through your churches or organizations? Yeah, and that's where it started, believe it or not. Okay? The next act that was passed was the Housing and Urban Development Act. You ever heard of HUD housing? Anybody ever heard that term, HUD housing? Okay, maybe too young. The Housing and Urban Development Act. Now, by looking at the name, Taylor Fulfer, what do you think the Housing and Urban Development Act might have to do with? Yes.
Quick question. So you know you said you had that extra sheet, and I thought mine was in my locker. What was it in my locker?
Well, you know that one that I had yesterday that I was going to give you because you thought you...
It was in my locker.
Yeah, it went to garbage after class, and so it's probably out in the back dealer, but I'll get you another. Okay, so Taylor, what does the Housing and Urban Development Act mean?
Probably something to do with housing.
Ding, 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 yes. Urban development. Andy, don't try to hide from me. Urban development, what does that mean? What does urban development mean? What's that? Kind of. And an urban area would be what type of area, Carmen?
Kind of like
Yeah.
nice house thing.
Okay, so why would he pass, think about his Great Society philosophy, what would the Housing and Urban Development Act maybe provide?
Housing.
Housing for what?
Housing.
Close. The legislation called for the construction of 250,000 low-rent, low-income housing units. Okay? Low-rent, low-housing income units. And I'll kind of tell you how HUD housing works in general, because you might be interested in this, okay?
Is it low rent, low income?
Yes, low-rent, low-income housing units, and I'll explain that to you. So the Housing and Urban Development Act called for the construction of 250,000 low-rent, low-income housing units across the country. And they still have them today. I think they have them over here on Sage Crossing or something over here, don't they? What does that mean? That means that your rent's based on what? Your income. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to help people that were underprivileged. So a lot of people have what's called HUD housing. There's HUD housing rentals and HUD housing purchases, and I'll explain the difference. But this was low-income housing rentals. So your rent was based monthly on how much money you made. And it was set up for people that could have affordable housing that were not doing very well financially. Now, HUD went farther, which is beyond this, in which people could apply to buy homes based on lower income. And so when I was first married and we were looking for housing, we didn't have any money, but we didn't qualify for HUD housing, but you look to assume a HUD loan. So if Ashton and her husband bought a HUD house at low interest rate because of her income, when she wanted to sell her house, I would look to maybe assume that loan because where would the interest rate be? Low. Okay? So it was a good selling point for someone that owned a HUD house because you wanted to assume that loan. And basically what you'd do is you'd say to me, well, Mr. Durrell, I'll sell you my house for X amount of $1,000 down and you take over the loan because you wanted that low interest money. Okay? They don't do a lot of that now, but that's what it came from. Okay, the third piece of legislation that was passed was called the Immigration Act. Immigration Act. Now, what do you think that had to do with? People immigrating into the United States, but it might not be what you think it is. What do you think the law did? It abolished something. What did it abolish? What's that? That's what you might think.
People communist place?
You might think that. Actually, it abolished the quota system for immigration. I want you to think about that. It abolished the quota system. What's a quota system? I had a quota system in this class.
Like how many numbers?
Not so much
The
that number of people. I had to limit this. I'm terrible at it, but I limited it to 28, which was stupid. But anyway, a quota system is where you limit the number of something someone's able to do. Well, if they abolished the quota system in the Immigration Act, they basically opened what? The borders to anybody. I mean, they didn't have a quota. It used to say like, you know, during this year only so many thousand people could immigrate in, and then this year only so many thousand. That was a quota system. The Immigration Act that was passed during the Johnson administration abolished that quota system, and it basically opened the borders.
Why did they do that?
What was his philosophy? He wanted to give people opportunities. Okay? All right, any questions on that? Well, we're going to move to the American Space Program turns to Gemini. Okay? The American Space Program turns to Gemini. And we've talked about the Mercury Space Program, and it kind of goes Mercury, then Gemini, then Apollo. That's kind of how we're going to follow this thing. So it's the second American space program that was established by NASA, was Project Gemini. Now, you know why Project Gemini was established? One single reason. What was the one reason we started the Gemini space project? But not yet. We're way above that. So let me think about that. So why did we start Mercury? What's that? Yeah, to catch up with the Russians. The reason we started Gemini, the sole purpose was to prepare the United States for what? A moon landing. So the Gemini project was used for a single purpose, simply to prepare the United States for a landing on the moon. President Kennedy promised that by the end of the decade we would land safely a man on the moon and return him back to Earth safely as well, by the end of the decade. So the Gemini project was used for that single purpose. Now, the Gemini missions would provide two specific things in preparation for that upcoming moon landing. They would provide two specific things. Now, what haven't we been able to do in the Mercury that we need to do better in the Gemini if we're going to land somebody on the moon? No, don't get out the teacher thing. What's that?
Get them like out of our, I don't know.
They've just been landing them in the ocean.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't been up there very long, have they? So the first specific things we need to prepare for was the ability to support astronauts in space for a length of time sufficient to land on the moon. This isn't going to happen in, 3.5 minutes. We're going to fly up to the moon and back. It's going to take some time. And they've got to be able to sustain man in space long enough to have a moon mission. So the first specific thing the preparation was to develop the ability to support astronauts in space for a length of time that would be sufficient for a moon landing. They got to find a way to keep guys up there alive long enough to get to the moon and back. The second thing that's going to have to do is you're not going to be able to land this spaceship on the moon. You're going to have what's called a lunar landing module, which we'll talk about, that they can put them in and it can come down and land on the moon while the ship itself orbits the moon. So in order to do that, they have we'll talk about these spaceships, but they're going to have a lunar lander inside. And they're going to have, well, I'll just show you. This is ahead of the game a little bit. But this is the Apollo, and Gemini look kind of like it. But what you have here is that this is a really long thing that looks like this. And all we're talking about here is the very tip of that. The rest of it's the booster that gets it up into space. So once it gets in space, all of the bottom stuff falls off, and you're left with this in space. And what happens is the astronauts are just in this top part here. We'll talk about it later. What's back in here? Oxygen, and this lunar module looks kind of like a caterpillar that's going to land on the moon. So they're going to have to get the astronauts from here into this lunar module. And what's going to happen is they're going to open up this part, and this lunar module is going to come out. And what's it going to have to do to get from the lunar module, for these guys from in here into that module? It's got to be able to dock. They got to be able to hook and dock so the men can get through and get into the lunar module. Because there's going to be 3 men that go to the moon. We'll talk about later. 2 are going to get in the lunar module and go down, and 1's going to stay and fly this spaceship around the moon while they're down there. So the second thing that the Gemini has to do is it has to be able to dock. They got to be able to come together and dock so they can open up a hatch so the 2 astronauts can get from the lunar rocket into that module. Okay? So the Gemini missions would provide 2 specific things in preparation for an upcoming moon landing. 1, they need to develop the ability to support astronauts in space for a length of time sufficient for a moon landing. And 2, they had to develop a rendezvous and docking technique. And if they were going to have a lunar landing, they had to get those astronauts from the spaceship to the lunar lander so it could go down. Now they're actually going to fly 2 flights simultaneously to do this rendezvous. And the Gemini flights are going to be called Gemini 6A and Gemini 7. So what they're going to do is they're going to send 2 different rocket ships up into space and dock them. And do the docking technique. And they're going to see if this works, and then they're going to perfect it in the Apollo missions to land on the moon. Okay? So Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 are going to be a combined flight that's going to develop the first American rendezvous and 2 piloted spacecraft to dock. Okay? Now, Gemini 6A is not going to be up there very long, but Gemini 7 is going to be up there a projected 2 weeks, which would be the longest time ever in American history that we had astronauts in space. So this is all trying to put things together so we can make a moon landing. So the Gemini 7 part of this is supposed to be in space for 2 weeks, which would be the longest time ever. Okay? Now, before they even did any of this, what did they have to pick? Gemini astronauts. And they picked 16 astronauts that would take part in these Gemini missions that would set up this moon flight that would happen during the Apollo mission. So 16 were picked. How many picked for the Mercury? 7. They're going to have 16. Now of these 16 astronauts that were selected for Gemini, 15 will continue on and fly in what program? Apollo. Okay? So they picked 16 astronauts for the Gemini program, and of those 16, 15 will participate in the astronaut program in the upcoming Apollo mission. And what's the Apollo mission going to do? Apollo 11? Successfully land the man on the moon, returning safely to Earth. So this one Gemini 6A and 7 mission isn't going to set every stage. It's simply going to be the one that sees if they can dock and rendezvous in space. So that'll take us to the story of Gemini 7. Gemini 7. Now, Gemini 7 was actually the 4th Gemini flight that went into space, but it's the first one that's going to try what? Docking and have the astronauts up in space for a lengthy period of time, 2 weeks. But it actually was the 4th mission of Gemini. They had previous missions just to kind of set up the Gemini 7 mission. Okay? Now, the astronauts that will be involved in Gemini 7, the command pilot, the man that's in charge, was Frank F. Borman II. Frank F. Borman II. Probably haven't, how many have heard of him? Anybody? Probably not. His pilot would be James A. Lovell, Jr. Anybody heard of James A. Lovell? James Lovell, Jr.? You ever heard of Apollo 13, in the movie Apollo 13? He was the command pilot on Apollo 13 later. But he will be the pilot for Gemini 7. So command pilot Frank F. Borman II will be the overall commander of Gemini 7, and his pilot will be James A. Lovell, Jr. Now, this is quite a story I'm quite proud of. Here's a signed picture up there of Frank Borman in the astronaut suit, and there's Frank Borman and I in Forsyth, Montana, about 2 years ago. He lives in Hysham, Montana, has a ranch there, and my best friend from high school, Brent Heberly, who owns Heberly Ford, Frank buys a lot of cars from him and vehicles for the ranch, And Brent called me one day, he says, hey, Frank Borman's gonna be here Saturday to pick up a new rig. And I talked to him, you wanna drive down and meet him? Well, it didn't take me long to get in the car. So, he's a very nice man, but that guy right there is Frank Borman. It was a thrill for me to meet him, very kind individual, and he's gonna have a bigger role in the space program later. I'm just kinda introduced you to him. Okay, well, Gemini 7 launched from the Kennedy Space Center on December 4th, 1965. It launched from the Kennedy Space Center on December 4th, 1965. Launched on December 4th, 1965. Splashed down to Earth on December 8th, 1965. So they took off on December 4th, 1965 and landed on December 18th, 1965. So they weren't quite how many days in space?
8 or 18?
18th. 4th and 18th. Okay? So how many days were they in space? Not quite.
Why was it launched in December though?
14.
Sure, what else?
Okay? Actually, they were in space 13 days, 18 hours, 39 minutes, and 1 second, if you care. Just a little bit less than 14 days. Almost 2 weeks. Longest space travel in history to that point. So the two astronauts spent nearly 14 days in space. If you care, 13 days, 18 hours, 35 minutes, and 1 second. Now, what's the most amount of orbits we've had around the Earth thus far that you're aware of? I'm trying to think how many times the last Mercury flight went through. Anyway, we'll worry about it later. Borman and Lovell went around the Earth 206 times. 206 times in that near 14 days. 206 times. That was actually just a little short of 500,000 nautical miles. So they traveled a total of 206 orbits of the Earth, which was a little less than 500,000 nautical miles. Now, what's the key to this? Who's Gemini 7 going to be joined with for a short period of time during their Gemini 6A? So Gemini 7 went up there for a length of time. Gemini 6A just came up to perform the docking technique and then went down. Does that make sense? So Gemini 7 would be joined on orbit by Gemini 6A to perform that rendezvous and that docking. Okay, it hasn't come yet, but we'll talk about it. So this is kind of how it went for Borman and Lovell. Launch was very normal. The astronauts spent their first day in space just doing some experiments and eating their first meal. That's kind of what they did. Launch was perfect for Gemini 7. The first day in space, the two astronauts basically just did some experiments and ate their first meal. Now, if you can picture this in your mind, because of the size of the capsule, the two men were seated in the capsule as two men would be seated in the front seat of a normal passenger car. So that's kind of how it's set up. Not real large. It'd be like you getting in your car to go to lunch, and you and your buddy are sitting next to each other. That's about what it was like. Now, their sleep periods at first were scheduled at the same time. So they were told to go to sleep at the same time, and they actually, although it was probably an exciting time for them, were able to get some sleep. Okay? So their sleep periods were scheduled at the same time, and the two men were able to actually get some sleep. Now, this is kind of interesting. The morning of December 5th, they woke up about 9 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, about 9 o'clock. This would be the first time in history during a space flight that one of the crew could do what? No, good guess. Take off his spacesuit. Before, they never took their spacesuits off. Okay? They always stayed in the protective suits. For the first time in spaceflight history, they're going to allow one of the crew to take off his spacesuit. Because if they're going to do this moon mission, can they stay in their spacesuits all the time? No. Okay? Now, why would NASA only allow one astronaut to be out of his suit at a time? Yeah, they have never done it before. So, somebody, they want to make sure somebody can get home. Okay?
Wait, was that like did they allow him or did they tell him?
No, he was told. It was part of the mission.
Because I wouldn't be too.
Yeah. So, NASA would only allow one astronaut to be out of his suit at the same time. So the two men agreed that Lovell would get out of his suit first because he was the larger of the two men. Maybe he felt he ought to be comfortable first. I don't know. Because these are uncomfortable. So the decision was made that Lovell would be the first one to get out of his suit because he was larger than Borman. Well, Lovell gets out of his suit. NASA orders Lovell to put his suit back on after a period of time, and Borman gets out of his suit. And basically they were doing this as an experiment. The doctors back in Houston wanted to see the effects of these astronauts being suited and being unsuited, okay, during the flight. It never had happened before. Is there any difference? Well, once they found out that it wasn't too big of a problem, and it started to get, what do you think, in that capsule? Hot, they allowed both astronauts to get out of the suits at the same time. But they checked that out because they weren't sure. It had never happened before. So that was kind of an important thing. So that was basically the December 5th, that first full day. They were in and out of their suits, and then both out of their suits because it was quite hot. Now picture again that you're sitting in this spacecraft up in space, the same as sitting in the front seat of a passenger car. Well, during their first 5 days in space, Gemini 7 had to perform 4 orbital adjustment burns. 4 orbital adjustment burns. And we'll talk about that. So during the first 5 days in space, Gemini 7 performed 4 different orbital adjustment burns. Now, what are adjustment burns? Anybody know in the space program? What are they? Anybody know what they are? It's kind of like hitting the gas on the gas pedal of your car to get from here to here. They're burns that basically move the capsule and move the capsule because those burns were used to get them in what? Orbit. So they get up there and they're sitting there and then they take a little burn over here and a burn over here and a burn over here, and pretty soon they get in orbit, and they use the Earth's orbit to get around 206 times during the mission. So to move a spacecraft, you got to burn. Basically like pushing your foot on the gas pedal. It's a burn, just like the rocket kind of taking off.